The bride introduced me to her parents as William's ex-wife. She said it with a practiced smile, her hand resting on my son's arm, her voice bright and clear enough that the caterer paused mid-pour. I stood there in my pearl earrings and the navy dress I had chosen specifically for this occasion, the one that took 3 hours to find because I wanted to look like a mother worth having, and I watched the words land on the faces around me. Not his mother, his father's ex-wife. As if my 42 years of marriage had been erased along with the man I buried 8 years ago. William would have known what to say, he always did. But William was gone, and I was 74 years old, standing in a reception hall in a city I had flown across the country to reach. And my son did not correct her. My name is Eleanor. I have been a mother for 47 years. I raised my son in a house I still own, paid for his education with money I earned, attended every school play and graduation and scraped-knee emergency room visit that his childhood contained. I was there when his father died, holding both their hands in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and roses, and I was the one who signed the checks that made this wedding possible. But standing in that reception hall, surrounded by white tablecloths and string quartet music, I was introduced as if I were a footnote. A historical inconvenience, someone who had once existed in relation to a dead man and served no purpose now. I smiled. I shook the hands that were offered. I found my table assignment and walked toward the back of the room, past the family section, past the friends and colleagues, past the long windows overlooking the garden where my son would pose for photographs I would never receive copies of. My table was near the kitchen doors. The chairs were the same as the others, white with satin bows. But there was a different quality to the light back here, something fluorescent mixing with the chandelier glow. I sat down next to a woman I had never met and watched her read my place card with a frown. The invitation had arrived 4 months earlier. It was printed on thick cream paper with gold edges, the kind that costs more per card than some people spend on groceries in a week. My son's name was embossed at the top, followed by his fiancée's, followed by a date and time and venue I would need to Google because nobody had thought to include directions. There was no personal note, no handwritten addition in the margin, just my name and address printed by a machine that didn't know or care who I was. I had called him when it arrived, left a voicemail, texted, called again. He responded 3 days later with a 2-sentence message. Logistics would be handled by the wedding planner, and he looked forward to seeing me there. I should have understood then, perhaps I did, but understanding and accepting are not the same thing, and I had spent 47 years believing that the silences between my son and me were temporary, phases, things that would resolve themselves if I were patient enough, generous enough, present enough. The flight had been 5 hours. The rideshare from the airport had cost $87. The hotel was not the one where the rest of the family was staying, though I hadn't known that until I arrived and found myself checking in alone to a room with a view of the parking structure. I had brought the pearl earrings William gave me for our 30th anniversary. I wore them now, touching one absently as I watched the other guests take their seats. They felt like armor, like proof that I had once been someone worth celebrating, even if no one in this room seemed to remember. The woman next to me introduced herself as a co-worker's aunt. She asked how I knew the couple. I opened my mouth to answer, and I realized I didn't know anymore. The co-worker's aunt was waiting for my answer. Her name was something with a P, Patrice perhaps. She had kind eyes and a corsage that suggested she had been given more consideration than I had received. I began, and felt the words catch in my throat like something physical. I'm David's mother. Her face changed. Something flickered behind the kindness, a recalibration of the sort that happens when information doesn't match expectation. She glanced at my place card, then at the family table visible across the room, then back at me. "Oh," she said, "I thought." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The rehearsal dinner had been the night before. I had not been invited. I learned this when I called the venue to confirm the time and was told, with some confusion, that the dinner was for immediate family and wedding party only. The woman on the phone had been apologetic. She suggested I might have the wrong event. I had sat in my hotel room that night, eating takeout from a restaurant I found on my phone, watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures because the silence felt too heavy without something to fill it. The room had one of those combination locks on the door, the kind that beeps when you enter the code, and I had lain awake for hours listening to the beeps from neighbouring rooms and wondering if any of them belonged to my son. He had not called. He had not texted. The wedding planner had sent a PDF with the ceremony time and a note about parking. Patrice was still looking at me. The string quartet had begun playing something I recognised from a commercial, classical music repurposed for soap advertisements, and the bride's family was laughing at something I couldn't hear from where I sat. "It's a lovely venue," I said, because that was true and it required nothing of me. She nodded. We both returned our attention to our napkins. The ceremony had been that morning. I had arrived early, as I always do, and found a seat in the third row on the groom's side. Not the front row. That was reserved, the card said, for the wedding party, but third row felt close enough. Close enough to see my son's face when he took his vows, close enough to be present for something I had spent 47 years preparing him for. He had looked handsome. That is what mothers notice, even mothers who have been relegated to the back tables and introduced by the wrong name. He wore a grey suit and a tie, the colour of the ocean on calm days, and when he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and clear. He did not look at me, not once. I told myself he was nervous. I told myself he was focused on his bride, as he should have been. I told myself that the absence of eye contact was not a message, not a statement, not a choice. But I have been telling myself things for a very long time, and I was beginning to grow tired of my own voice. The servers were bringing the first course now, something with salmon and microgreens, arranged on plates like tiny works of art. Patrice asked about the flights in, and I told her mine had been delayed by weather. She asked about the hotel, and I mentioned the view of the parking structure, and she laughed politely. We were strangers making the best of a seating chart that had placed us together for reasons neither of us understood. And I was 74 years old, sitting at a table that faced the kitchen doors, wearing pearl earrings that meant nothing to anyone but me. The bride's parents were giving a toast now. Their voices carried across the room, warm and practiced, full of the kind of stories that parents tell at weddings, because those are the stories that get told. I listened to them describe their daughter's first steps, her first words, her first heartbreak. No one would be asking me to give a toast. I excused myself before the main course arrived. The hallway outside the reception was cool and dim, lit by wall sconces that cast long shadows on the carpet. I found a bench near the coat room and sat down, letting the fabric of my dress settle around me like something deflating. My feet hurt. My heart hurt worse. Through the doors, I could hear the sounds of the reception continuing without me. Laughter and music and the clink of glasses raised in celebration. It was the sound of a family event I had been erased from, and I sat there listening to it like someone pressing on a bruise. I had brought 3 gifts. One for the couple, wrapped in silver paper with a bow I had tied myself. 2 smaller packages for the bride and groom individually, personal things I had chosen with more care than I wanted to admit. They were in my suitcase at the hotel because there had been no gift table at the ceremony, and by the time I reached the reception, I couldn't find anyone to ask. The automated payments were still running. I had set them up 2 years ago when the engagement was announced, monthly transfers into an account David had opened specifically for wedding expenses. I had never asked how the money was being spent. That was not a mother's place, I told myself. It comes from. A mother trusts, but I was beginning to understand what my trust had purchased. Grandma. The voice came from the end of the hallway. I looked up and saw June standing there in a bridesmaid dress the colour of champagne, her dark hair pinned up in a way that made her look older than 23. She was holding her heels in one hand, walking toward me in bare feet on the cold floor. "June," I said, "shouldn't you be inside?" She sat down next to me without answering, tucking her dress beneath her in a practiced motion. She had her father's eyes, but her mother's chin, and when she looked at me, I saw something I hadn't expected. Anger. Not at me, for me. I heard what she said. June's voice was low, careful not to carry. When she introduced you to her parents, I was at the next table. I touched my earrings again. The pearl felt smooth and cool beneath my fingertip, unchanged by everything that had happened around it. "It's fine," I said, because that was what I had been saying for as long as I could remember. She probably didn't mean she meant it. June cut me off, but gently, the way you cut someone off when you love them and can't let them hurt themselves anymore. Grandma, she meant it. And Dad knew. He helped plan the seating. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "The seating? You're at table 14, the back table, next to the kitchen, in case anything goes wrong and they need to clear it quickly." June's jaw was tight. "I saw the chart last week. I asked Dad why you weren't at the family table. He said Victoria felt it would be complicated." Complicated. That was the word he had used. As if my presence at my own son's wedding was a logistical problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be honoured. I remembered the hospital room again. William's hand in mine, growing colder. David on the other side of the bed, crying in a way I had never seen before and have never seen since. We had held each other afterward, the three of us becoming two, and I had promised myself that we would stay close. That loss would bind us rather than break us. 8 years. That was how long it had taken for the binding to dissolve entirely. "The rehearsal dinner," I said. "I wasn't invited." "I know. I asked about that too." June reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were warm against my cold ones. "He said it was a small venue, not enough space. There were 42 people at the rehearsal dinner." "I know, Grandma." We sat there in silence for a long moment. Through the doors I could hear someone giving another toast, more laughter, more celebration. The string quartet had switched to something modern, a song I didn't recognize but could feel the youth in. "I've been sending money," I said, "for 2 years. Every month for the wedding." June nodded slowly. "I figured." Did any of it? I stopped myself. The question felt too much like begging. Never mind. "The flowers are beautiful," June said carefully, "and the venue is expensive. I'm sure it helped." It helped. That was all I was now, a help. Not a mother, not a grandmother worth seating with family, not a person whose name mattered enough to say correctly. Just a source of funds that had helped make possible an event where I was being systematically rendered invisible. I understood something then, sitting in that dim hallway with my granddaughter's hand in mine. I understood that I had done this to myself, not through malice, not through error, but through the slow accumulation of silences. Every time I had accepted the unreturned call, the cancelled visit, the holiday excuse, I had taught my son that my presence was optional. My feelings were negotiable. My role could be redefined without my consent. I had spent 47 years being a mother, and somewhere in those years, I had stopped asking to be treated like one. "What do you want to do?" June asked. The question hung between us. What did I want? I had spent so long considering what everyone else wanted that my own desires had grown faint, like a voice heard from very far away. I wanted to be introduced correctly. I wanted to sit at the family table. I wanted my son to look at me during his wedding and see me, really see me, the way he had when he was small and I was the center of his world. But those things were not possible anymore. The wedding was happening. The introduction had been made. The choices that led to this moment stretched back years, and none of them could be unmade by wanting. "I think," I said slowly, "I want to go back to my hotel." June squeezed my hand. "I'll walk you out." "No." I shook my head, patting her fingers. "You should be inside. You're a bridesmaid. You have duties." "My duty is to you too." I looked at my granddaughter then, really looked at her. She had grown into someone I barely recognized, someone fierce and loyal in ways that surprised me. Her mother had been difficult, had made June choose sides in a divorce that had nothing to do with her, and yet here she was, sitting on a bench in bare feet, offering me the kind of solidarity I had stopped expecting from anyone. "Your father loves you," I said. It felt important to say, even now. Whatever else is true, that's true, I know. June's voice was steady. "But love isn't supposed to look like this, Grandma. Not for you, not for anyone." She helped me stand, found my coat in the coat room and held it while I slipped my arms through the sleeves. I felt old in that moment, older than I had felt in years, and I did not fight the feeling. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said. "You'll be busy. The brunch, the dye, I'll call you tomorrow." She hugged me there in the hallway, and I held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her perfume and the hairspray the stylists must have used. Through the reception doors, I could hear the DJ announcing the first dance. I walked out through the lobby without looking back. The rideshare back to the hotel was quiet. The driver asked if I had enjoyed the wedding, and I said yes, because explaining would have required energy I no longer possessed. He told me about his daughter's wedding, how beautiful she had looked, how he had cried during the first dance. I nodded at appropriate intervals and watched the streetlights pass. My hotel room was exactly as I had left it, the bed still made in the way housekeeping does it, tight corners and too many pillows. My suitcase open on the luggage rack, the gifts for David and Victoria still wrapped in their silver paper. I looked at them for a long moment before closing the suitcase and zipping it shut. I would not be giving them to anyone. The automated payments were scheduled for the 15th of each month. I had set them up through my banking app 2 years ago, a recurring transfer that required no thought and no interaction. That had seemed like a kindness at the time, a way of supporting my son without asking for acknowledgement, a way of being present without being present. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the app on my phone. The screen glowed blue in the dim room, showing me a history of transfers I had never examined closely. 2 years of payments, 24 separate transactions, each one a small piece of myself I had sent into a silence that never answered. The wedding was tomorrow, in the past tense now. The money had already served whatever purpose it was meant to serve. But the payments were still scheduled to continue for 6 more months, the final installments of a support plan I had designed for a relationship that no longer existed. I pressed the button to cancel the recurring transfer. The app asked me to confirm. I confirmed. Then I sat there in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The flight home was the next morning. I had booked it months ago, back when I assumed I would want to stay for the brunch, the gift opening, the quiet family moments that follow a wedding. I had imagined sitting with my son over coffee, telling him how beautiful the ceremony was, meeting his new wife as a daughter-in-law rather than a stranger who had mispronounced my relationship to my own child. None of that would happen now. And I found, to my surprise, that I felt no desire to make it happen. The want had drained out of me somewhere between the reception hall and the rideshare, leaving something emptier but clearer in its place. I slept poorly, woke early, took another rideshare to the airport, and moved through security with the same automatic motions I had performed 100 times before. The plane was half empty, and I sat by the window, watching the city where my son now lived shrink beneath us until it was just shapes and shadows, then nothing at all. Home looked the same as it always did. The same porch, the same garden, the same front door I had walked through 10,000 times in the 38 years since William and I bought this house with money we had saved for a decade. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click, and I stepped inside. The silence here was different. It was mine. I put my suitcase in the bedroom and stood for a moment in the hallway, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. David at 5, at 10, at 18, his graduation, his first job, his engagement announcement. Pictures of a life I had been present for, had documented, had treasured in the way mothers treasure evidence of their children's becoming. There was a photo of David and Victoria at the bottom of the stairs. I had framed it myself when they sent their engagement pictures, choosing the one where they both looked happiest, where the light caught them in a way that suggested permanence. I walked to it now and lifted it off its hook. The frame was heavier than I remembered. I carried it to the hall closet and set it on the top shelf, facing the wall. I was not erasing them. I was simply choosing not to look at them. There was a difference. The mail had piled up while I was gone, bills and advertisements, and a sympathy card from a neighbour whose cat had died. I sorted through it at the kitchen table, making neat stacks the way William had always done, and I found myself thinking about all the sorting I had done over the years. All the quiet labour that had kept this household running. All the invisible work that nobody noticed until it stopped. I had stopped now, not all at once, but in increments that were beginning to add up. The phone rang 3 times that afternoon. I saw David's name on the screen each time. I let it ring until voicemail picked up, and I did not listen to the messages he left. There was a kind of power in that silence, a power I had never allowed myself before. The next morning, I made an appointment with my lawyer. Grace Chen had handled my affairs since William's death, a small woman with sharp eyes who spoke in sentences that wasted nothing. I liked her. I trusted her. And when I sat down in her office and told her what I wanted, she did not try to talk me out of it. "You want to change the beneficiary structure," she said. Not a question. I want to change everything. I had thought about this on the plane, thought about it through the sleepless night and the quiet morning. David is currently the executor of my estate. He has power of attorney. He's the primary beneficiary of my retirement accounts and the house. Grace nodded, making notes on her legal pad. I want to remove him from all of it. The pen stopped moving. Grace looked at me, and I saw her weighing her words the way lawyers do, searching for the question that would uncover what I really meant. "May I ask why?" "You may." I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the cool weight of my wedding ring against my fingers. He introduced me to his in-laws as his father's ex-wife. He seated me at the back table. He excluded me from the rehearsal dinner and didn't return my calls for weeks before the wedding. He has spent the past 8 years treating me like an inconvenience, and I have spent those same 8 years pretending not to notice. I took a breath. My voice was steady, which surprised me. I am 74 years old. I have a granddaughter who loves me. I have a house and savings and a life that I have built through my own effort. And I am tired of waiting for my son to remember that I am his mother's. Grace set down her pen. "What would you like the new structure to look like?" I told her. The house would go to June, held in trust until she turned 30. My retirement accounts would be split between June and a scholarship fund I had been thinking about for years, something that would help first-generation college students the way I had once needed help. The power of attorney would transfer to Grace herself, with June as backup. David would receive a fixed amount, enough to acknowledge the relationship without pretending it was what it once was. "He'll contest it," Grace said, not warning me, just stating facts. Let him. I straightened in my chair. I have spent 47 years giving my son everything he needed and most of what he wanted. I have one thing left to give, and I choose to give it to the people who see me, not the ones who look through me. Grace made more notes. We discussed timelines, paperwork, the process of changing beneficiary designations across multiple accounts. It was complicated. It would take weeks. I did not care. When I walked out of her office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The box was in the basement. I had kept it for years without looking inside, a cardboard archive of receipts and statements and check carbons that documented the money I had spent on my son's behalf. The tutors, the summer camps, the car he crashed at 19, and the repairs I paid for without comment. The apartment deposits, the medical bills he forgot to submit to insurance, the loans for business ventures that never quite worked out. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, more than I wanted to count. I carried the box up the stairs one slow step at a time, my knees protesting in the way they always did now, and I set it on the back patio where the fire pit sat unused since the last autumn William was alive. The afternoon was cool and clear, perfect burning weather. I did not start immediately. Instead, I sat in one of the patio chairs and opened the box, lifting each document one at a time. Some of them were faded now, the ink bleeding into the paper in ways that made the numbers hard to read. Others were crisp, recent, evidence of habits I had never managed to break. There was a receipt from David's college bookstore dated 25 years ago. $237 for textbooks he had forgotten to tell me he needed. I remembered the phone call, the panic in his voice, the way I had driven to the bank that same afternoon to wire the money because I could not stand the thought of him doing without. I set it aside in the fire pit. There was an invoice for a wedding photographer consultation. $300 dated 18 months ago. David had asked me to pay it as a favor, promising to pay me back when things settled down. Things had never settled down. I had never asked. Into the fire pit. There was a credit card statement from 7 years ago showing a charge for airfare I had purchased when David called to say he missed his father and wanted to come home for Christmas. He had cancelled the trip 2 days later, something about work, something about being too busy. I had eaten the cost of the change fees without mentioning it. Into the fire pit. I worked through the box for nearly an hour, sorting memories into piles of paper that documented the quiet ways I had been taken for granted. Not all of them were David's fault. Some of them were choices I had made freely, gifts I had wanted to give. But others, too many others, were the receipts of a relationship that had become transactional without my noticing. I had been paying for access to my own son, and the payment had never bought me what I truly wanted. The matches were in the kitchen drawer where they had always been. I struck one and held it to the corner of the oldest receipt, watching the flame catch and spread. The paper curled and blackened, releasing smoke that smelled like old basements and forgotten obligations. I fed the fire one document at a time, slow, deliberate, each one a thing I was choosing to let go. David called twice while I sat there. I saw his name appear on my phone screen, watched it ring through to voicemail, and returned my attention to the flames. There would be time for conversations later, or there would not be. Either way, I was no longer the one who would initiate. June texted me that evening, a simple message, "Thinking of you." I meant what I said. I wrote back, "I know. Thank you." The fire burned down to embers by sunset. I sat watching the last of the glow fade, feeling the warmth on my face and the cool air at my back. The box was empty now. The patio smelled of smoke and closure. I went inside and made myself dinner for one, soup and bread and a glass of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. This felt special enough. It felt like the beginning of something, though I could not yet say what. The house was quiet around me, not empty, quiet. The silence of a place that belonged to me and held no expectations I had not chosen. I slept well that night. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I slept without waiting for a phone to ring. The weeks that followed were strange and slow. I settled into a routine that had nothing to do with my son. Morning walks, afternoon reading, evenings in the garden, watching the light change on the flowers I had planted years ago and never properly admired. Grace called with updates about the paperwork. June called every few days just to talk. The world continued turning, and I continued with it. David did not stop calling. I kept a mental count at first, 12 calls in the first week, 8 in the second. His voicemails grew longer, more insistent, cycling through confusion and frustration and something that might have been guilt. I listened to a few of them, enough to understand the shape of what he was feeling, and then I deleted them without responding. This was not punishment. I was not trying to hurt him. I was simply choosing to wait until I was ready, and I was not ready yet. Victoria sent a card 3 weeks after the wedding, a thank you note, printed on the same cream paper as the invitation, with a generic message about appreciating my support. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of what had happened at the reception. Just gratitude for the money I had sent. I put the card in the recycling and did not think about it again. The lawyer's office called on a Thursday. The paperwork was ready for my signature. I drove there myself, taking the long way through the parts of town I loved best. The library where I had taken David for story time. The park where he had learned to ride a bicycle. The ice cream shop we used to visit on summer afternoons, back when he still reached for my hand without being asked. Those memories were real. They mattered, but they did not obligate me to accept treatment that diminished me. Love was not a transaction, and the love I had given did not purchase the right to be treated as invisible. I signed the papers, initialed where Grace indicated, watched her stamp and file and record the changes that would define what remained of my legacy. "How do you feel?" Grace asked when it was done. I considered the question carefully, the way she had taught me to consider all legal matters. "I feel like myself," I said, "for the first time in a long time." There were other changes in those weeks, small ones that accumulated into something larger. I rearranged the living room furniture, moving the couch to face the garden window instead of the television. I cleared out the guest bedroom that had been waiting for visitors who never came, turning it into a reading room with the armchair William had loved and a lamp that cast warm light in the evenings. I cancelled the landline I had kept for decades because David had once said he found it easier to reach. Each change was a statement, a reclamation, a way of saying, to no one but myself, that this house and this life belonged to me. The bank statements came at the end of the month, and for the first time I read them carefully. I saw the gaps where the wedding transfers had been. I saw the balance that remained. I saw the evidence of a financial life I had managed for decades without ever quite acknowledging its scope. I was not wealthy, but I was comfortable. And that comfort had been earned through 40 years of work, of saving, of quiet frugality that had never asked for recognition. I opened a new savings account that week, named June as the beneficiary, transferred into it the amount I had been sending David each month, redirecting the flow of resources toward someone who saw me as a person rather than a service. The call came on a Sunday afternoon, not from David this time, from Victoria. I let it ring 4 times before answering. When I spoke, my voice was calm. "Hello, Victoria. Eleanor." A pause. "Thank you for answering. I wasn't sure I would." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, the faint sounds of a house I had never visited in the background. "I need to apologize," she said, "for what I said at the wedding. The way I introduced you. It was..." She stopped, searching for words. "It was cruel. I didn't think about it beforehand, and that's almost worse, that I didn't think." I listened. I did not help her. "David and I have been talking about you, about what happened." Victoria's voice was smaller now, younger somehow. He didn't know what to say. He still doesn't. "But I wanted you to know that I see it now. What I did. And I'm sorry." The silence stretched between us, filled with everything that had happened and everything that might still happen. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "I appreciate the call." "Does that mean it means I appreciate the call?" I let the words settle. "Anything else will take time. More time than either of us probably wants. But thank you." I hung up before she could respond, set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the conversation move through me. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a door that had opened, just slightly, onto whatever came next. David came to the house on a Tuesday. I was in the garden when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The engine sound was familiar, the same sedan he had been driving for years, and I straightened from the roses I had been pruning with a slowness that had nothing to do with my knees. He looked smaller than I remembered. That was my first thought. Not physically smaller, though time had begun to soften the edges of the young man I had raised. Smaller in presence, less certain of his right to occupy space. Mum. His voice caught on the word. Can we talk? I set down my pruning shears, took off my gardening gloves, moved toward the patio chairs with a deliberateness that made him wait. Sit, I said. He sat. The silence between us stretched for a long moment. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the boy who had cried when his goldfish died, the teenager who had screamed that he hated me and apologized an hour later, the young man who had held my hand at his father's funeral. All of those versions lived inside the person sitting across from me now, and I loved them all. But love, I had learned, was not the same as acceptance, not the same as permission. Victoria called you, he said finally. She did. She told me about the apology. He rubbed his hands against his thighs, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. I should have called first. I should have called a long time ago. Yes, I said, you should have. The honesty landed between us like something heavy. David flinched. I did not soften it. I've been trying to understand, he said, how we got here, how I let things get this far. And I keep coming back to the same thing. I didn't think about you. I didn't stop and think about what you might be feeling, what the wedding might look like from where you were standing. And that's... He stopped, swallowing. That's not who I want to be. And yet it is who you were. I know, his voice cracked. Mum, I know, and I am so sorry. The words hung in the air. I had waited weeks to hear them, had imagined this moment during the sleepless nights and the quiet afternoons, had rehearsed what I might say in response, but now that the moment was here, the rehearsals felt inadequate. Do you know what happened at your wedding? I asked. Not what Victoria told you afterward, what actually happened from the moment I arrived to the moment I left. David shook his head slowly. Not all of it. I took a rideshare from the airport. $87. No one offered to pick me up. I kept my voice steady, factual. I checked into a hotel that was not where the rest of the family was staying. I was not invited to the rehearsal dinner. At the reception, I was seated at a table near the kitchen with strangers. Your wife introduced me to her parents as your father's ex-wife. And